Okay, we're going to have three presenters that are going to talk about planning for the future. We are going to explore well-being and narratives in a post-industrial urban region, look at knowledge production and local community council commissioning, and then explore mortality related to housing conditions in Belgium. So we're going to start off the session with Annie Saunders from the University of Cardiff. And if you want to begin, Annie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to share my video that I've pre-recorded. So hopefully I'll try and do this now and see if it works. Share sound and let me know if you hear. Hello, my name is Annie Saunders and I'm a PhD candidate from Cardiff University in Wales, UK. My presentation will be discussing how radical changes in the policy design landscape of Wales are impacting on approaches to regional development. In order to provide more clarity, I'll first give a quick overview of the presentation structure. In the introduction, I'll outline the broader context of the overall research that brings to focus the influence and impact of economistic approaches to development in old industrial regions. I'll highlight the overall aim of this paper, which is to determine the extent to which well-being as a goal and metric has increased in prominence, influence, and effectiveness in tackling inequality in smaller regions. The theoretical framework will outline where these debates are situated and show how they relate to the case study, thereby informing the research questions. Before introducing the case study, I will explain the political context in which it is situated. The case study will present an example of how Wales and regions within it are adapting to the new policy landscape. I'll conclude by highlighting the capacity of smaller regions, despite having many limiting factors, to take a more equitable approach to regional development. What is this paper discussing? The overall research forms part of a wider European project working alongside 4 other higher education and research institutes in Europe. Agents of Change in Old Industrial Regions in Europe is funded by the VW Foundation and looks at the role of agents and agency in influencing change and engendering new path developments. The research itself sits within wider discussions about regional development in Europe and the influence and impact of EU policy on smaller, more peripheral regions. Dominant approaches to regional development are often criticised for prioritising economic efficiency and competitiveness and for viewing equity to be a byproduct of economic growth in successful regions. Old industrial regions located outside major urban areas are most disadvantaged because they can neither rely on their own resources nor benefit from growth taking place in more prosperous metro regions. As a result, there has been a surge in interest in discovering a more sustainable metric for regional development that would better reconcile the goals of economic growth and human well-being. In Wales, we're focusing these ideas by looking at wider discussions around how development has often been done to places rather than with them. The inability of such developments to adequately address growing issues of inequality has in turn raised questions around agency. This paper will challenge the relevance and effectiveness of economistic approaches to development in smaller, more peripheral regions, and will bring into focus alternative ways that are being used to address big issues such as inequality. It focuses on the rise of the well-being narrative in Wales, signalling a radical shift in approach to long-term and sustainable policy design. More specifically, it looks at a case study in the old industrial town of Llanelli and considers how regional approach to development is changing. This research aims to develop a better understanding of the emergence of new development paths in old industrial regions and demonstrates the influence and impact of a rise in the well-being narrative on policy and practice in Wales. The theoretical base of this research draws on debates in a broad range of disciplines, but focuses predominantly on challenging and enriching debates around economic and political geography. Regional development theory conceptualizes regional disparities as a development gap between leading and lagging regions, caused by low economic productivity in the latter. Evolutionary economic geography focuses on the adaptation of the economic landscape over time and the interaction between temporal and spatial contingency and systematic necessity. Economic and political geography is predominantly guided by the impact of economic, political, and social changes on places and their relationships to policy and planning. Development in this context is almost always focused on economistic agendas that promote growth in large urban areas, despite there being growing scepticism over the effectiveness of economistic approaches. Therefore, this research seeks to enrich these debates by challenging economistic approaches to development and to question the practical relevance to smaller, more peripheral regions. So what is the relationship and relevance of these series to changes seen in Wales? Let us first consider the spatial context of these series, which tend to centre on large urban areas. Wales is a small country with a population of approximately 3.1 million people. There are very few large urban areas. Therefore, as a matter of practicality alone, an economy focused solely on growth and scale is not best suited to Wales. The second thing to consider is our governance structure. It has a devolution settlement with a reserved power model, which means that whilst the Welsh Parliament holds power in many areas, including economic development, some areas are reserved to the UK Parliament. But despite of or because of these limitations, Wales is beginning to adopt a more equitable approach to regional development that better reflects the ambitions and capacity of its people and places. This paper therefore seeks to shift the lens away from a promotion of growth in large urban areas and on to the rise of the well-being narrative in smaller regions. In light of this, the research will be guided by the following question. How are new development paths created in Wales's old industrial regions? And this main question will be accompanied by the following sub-questions. Who or what are the agents of change responsible for the creation of new development paths? What are the barriers to change and local conflicts that might be caused by such transformations? From a methodology point of view, this research will use a case study approach. The analysis will focus on agents' motivation and resources, narratives of the region's future, institutional arrangements and policies, and socio-cultural and historical contexts. Data collection will be conducted through qualitative methods such as semi-structured interviews. I thought I would briefly touch on how the pandemic has impacted on my research. My data collection timeline aligns perfectly with the start of the pandemic, and so most of my interviews were conducted over Zoom or Teams. Not being able to capture people in their normal surroundings within the context in which the research is situated has most certainly had an impact on the data. However, what I think is interesting is how operating within this digital context has had a levelling effect on the power dynamics between interviewer and interviewees. Many of those interviewed have been people in positions of authority, such as high-level politicians and CEOs of large companies. Under normal circumstances, you would be meeting these people in their offices or boardrooms, spaces that could be perceived as intimidating. And so the compromise on both sides of having to conduct these interviews online has balanced the power dynamics somewhat. How that will impact on the data, I'm not exactly sure, but it's certainly very interesting. Let us first look at the place in which the research is focusing on. Llanelli is your archetypal old industrial town located on the southwest coast of Wales. In the post-industrial era, Llanelli continues to struggle and adapt to new forms of employment. Yet despite the decline in the UK's manufacturing sector, it has managed to retain a strong residual base of companies. However, areas within Llanelli are some of the most deprived areas in Wales, with ill health and unemployment being some of the key legacies of industry. Next, we'll look at the policy context of Wales. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the first of its kind in the world, legally requires public bodies in Wales to think about the long-term impact of their decisions and to make long-lasting positive change to current and future generations. The unique context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act gives Wales the ambition, permission, and legal obligation to improve its social, cultural, environmental, and economic well-being. This new policy landscape in Wales has allowed for a new model of development to emerge that challenges economistic agendas whilst building its foundations on the 7 goals of well-being. So how do these policies work in practice? This research looks at the City Deal model. These large investment programmes are tasked with delivering projects that address specific regional weaknesses, with its core aim of generating economic growth. The deal that the research focuses on is the Swansea Bay City Deal, which is an investment of up to 1.3 billion in 9 major programmes and projects across the region. However, as these deals continue to be a key driver of economic activity in the UK, there is some concern as to whether the UK government's drive for GDP growth and the Welsh Government's ambition for a sustainable economy can both be achieved at the same time. Let's take a closer look at the case study. The Pentre Awel Wellness and Life Science Village in Llanelli is one of 9 projects that forms part of the Swansea Bay City Deal. It will be situated along the Llanelli coastline on the site of an old copper works and will bring together health, leisure, business and research. It is the first development of its size and scope in Wales and aims to provide world-class medical research and healthcare delivery, and to support and encourage people to live active and healthy lives. It works within its given development structures, which is the City Deal, yet challenges their core economistic agendas. Instead of seeing growth as key to achieving improved well-being, this approach views improving well-being not only as a goal, but also as a mechanism for achieving it. It directly addresses some of the negative legacies of industry by promoting and facilitating well-being and upskilling those in the area and beyond within the field of health and leisure. So why this case study? This project is underpinned by a radical new policy landscape, propelled by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. In the past, a lot of time has been spent retrofitting this ambitious piece of legislation into regeneration projects, often arguably in a tokenistic way. With Pentre Awel, they have been able to design the project based on the goals and ways of working, embed them in the plans and influence how they develop. It is a prime example of a new model of development that is being built in Wales and demonstrates that well-being is an essential aspect of agency. Therefore, by working to improve it, people and places will become empowered. To conclude, I'll begin by addressing the research questions. How are new development paths created in Wales's old industrial regions? Wales has taken a radical new approach to policy design that is responding to global debates about well-being and addressing them on a national and local level. This new landscape allows for a more holistic approach to development that considers GDP growth as only part of the solution as opposed to the answer. Focused and meaningful collaborations between public bodies across all levels of government, education and the private sector have been instrumental in building this process. Who or what are the agents of change responsible for the creation of a new development path? The rise of the well-being narrative within and beyond the context of regional development has played a significant role in influencing the ambitions of the Welsh Government. Wales, along with countries such as New Zealand, are pursuing a new course that refocuses attention away from the idea of superstar economies onto more inclusive ideas of well-being of people and the planet. This shift in narrative and focus demonstrates a far more holistic approach to tackling inequality, which will arguably generate more opportunity to build agency for those who have little or none. What are the barriers to change and local conflicts that might be caused by such transformations? Things have developed very quickly since Brexit, and there is a real concern and fear about the hostility of the UK government towards the devolved administrations. This rapid change in tone from the UK government reflects their ambition for a more centralised system that bypasses the governments of the devolved nations and appealing to and dealing with local authorities directly. So how does this impact on my research? Not all the funding for the Swansea Bay City Deal has been transferred to Wales by the UK Treasury, which has a direct impact on Pentre Awel in Llanelli. Therefore, this new dynamic could still have a significant impact on this deal and others in the future. The structure of development may not have radically changed yet, but the main thrust of the conversation has certainly shifted. Development projects are being designed with a well-being agenda in mind and not being retrospectively bolted on. The devolved government of Wales has developed an ambitious agenda with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that places a firm emphasis on the importance of long-term planning. showing how radical changes can be implemented within the confines of current frameworks. Well-being as a concept is far more commonplace and widely accepted, and COVID has only highlighted this awareness of well-being beyond our own individual health. This situation has also enabled health boards to get a better handle on the local population, therefore a deeper understanding of their needs. What this means in relation to Pentre Awel is that it has a better chance of becoming embedded into the culture of the region because its aims and objectives chime with and reflect the needs of the place and the time in which it is situated. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Annie. That was...
Thank you.
You could be a voice actress.
Oh gosh, no.
It was very, very well done. We have, we're going to change things up a little bit. We have a time for maybe one question. Does anyone have any questions for Annie? Whether it's by chat, hand up, or turn off the mic, or turn on your mic.
You're welcome to send questions directly or openly over chat if you like. Thank you.
I just have one quick question for you. How are they defining well-being? What kind of measures are they looking at when you're looking at this policy direction?
Sorry?
How do they define it? How are you defining well-being? Because it's quite broad, and I'm kind of curious how you look at it and how you measure it in such a planning, in a planning project like this.
Yeah, that is quite a difficult, because it is, like you say, so broad and nuanced and also personal and impersonal at the same time. In terms of the Pentre Awel project itself, they're using essentially what the Wellbeing Future Generations Act has laid out, which is the 7 goals, and they're based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they are, I suppose, a policy reflection of those goals. How it works in practice is, of course, a different question, because I should probably note that Pentre Awel hasn't actually been built yet. So these are all concepts I'm sort of dealing with. And I suppose I'm just arguing that conceptually, this could be a really good development in the way that we regenerate places. How it works in practice will, of course, we're yet to see. And hopefully this project does go ahead, because it's been in the pipeline for a number of years.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure you'll get lots of great questions, but thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks very much.
And we're doing some things during your talk too, Annie. We're switching the talks up a little bit because I believe Martina and I are both in at the same time zone. And so she has another appointment that she has to go to. So Ed and Martina have switched places. So Martina, I'm not too sure which institution you're from in Belgium, but you can probably clarify. Where are you from? What's the name of the institution?
So I'm affiliated with UC Louvain at Louvain-la-Neuve, and also with the University of Hasselt in both Belgium, and as well with the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at Sciences Po in Brussels.
Okay, so it's quite a mix, and I was trying to figure out.
It is.
Okay, so Martina, you can go ahead.
I will just share my presentation. I hope you can see it well.
Yeah, you can see it.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me. In my presentation, I will discuss my work in progress on inequalities in mortality and health associated with housing conditions in Belgium between 1991 and 2019. And you might also notice that my abstract lists years 1991 to 2015, but I recently gained an access to most recent data, and therefore I was able to extend the period covered by my study till 2019. So in Belgium, majority of studies on socioeconomic inequalities defined people with low socioeconomic status by their income, education, occupation, or their place of residence. Although housing is one of the environmental factors that plays a central role in individuals' health, and it is also a reflection of socioeconomic status that might carry physical, psychological, or social risk for impaired well-being, its impact on mortality has been less investigated. Therefore, the objective of our study is to measure inequality in mortality that is attributable to housing deprivation in Belgium between the years 1991 and 2019. So in terms of the methodology, first I would like to describe the housing indices that we created. So to measure housing deprivation, we created housing deprivation indices. We utilized data on housing characteristics from the years 1991, 2001, and 2011 Belgian population censuses, and developed area-level housing deprivation indices at the level of the smallest geographical unit in Belgium, which is the statistical sector. As I mentioned, for every respective year, so 1991, 2001, and 2011. Each index was based on a group of indicators encompassing multiple deprivation dimensions. For instance, occupancy status and its density, absence of central heating, absence of bathroom, toilet, absence of kitchen or installation, or absence of internet connection. And the selection of the indicators had to take into account the following. So the data accessibility and availability, they have to be the best possible measures of deprivation. And also they have to be country and time specific. So what we did with these indicators within each of the indices, so for the year 1991, 2001, and 2011, a proportion of deprived population in a given statistical sector was calculated. So for instance, it was a proportion of individuals without internet connection in the statistical sector in the year 1991. Then maximum likelihood factor analysis was used to combine these indicators into a single score at the level of statistical sector. And then statistical sectors were ranked based on this factor analysis score from the least to the most deprived. And finally, deciles were assigned in a way that the most deprived population falls into the first 10%. So just once again, I emphasize that the same methodology was followed for 1991, 2001, and 2011. However, the indicators might differ by year due to their availability and accessibility. In terms of data, as I mentioned, for the housing deprivation indices, we used census data. But for mortality, we utilized individual level data at ages 0 to 100 from the National Register in Belgium between January 1st, 1991 and December 31st, 2019. Data included the descendant's age, sex, and personal identification number that allowed us to find the statistical sector at which the individual was registered in the year of death. So in terms of the statistical methods, first, I would like to emphasize that we modeled 10-year periods. So between the years 1991 and 2000, we used the housing deprivation index based on census 1991. And for period 2001 and 2011, we used the housing deprivation index based on census 2001. And for the last 9-year period, it was 2011 to 2019, we used housing index based on census 2011. So we look on multiple indicators of health inequality on the age standardized mortality rate. So we computed age standardized mortality rates per 100,000 person years by deprivation decile, sex, and time period using the sex and age structure of Belgian population in 2018. Then we calculated the population attributable fraction. So the mortality attributable to housing deprivation inequality was calculated as the difference between the observed and expected deaths in all deciles if they had the mortality rates of the least deprived decile. And it was expressed as an excess death count, but we also expressed the difference as the population attributable fraction. Lastly, we also looked at the years of life lost. So this health indicator was calculated as the difference between the years lost due to death before the age of 75 in each cohort and corresponding least deprived cohort. So what did the results say? So our study covered about 262 million person years in people aged between 0 to 100 plus, with almost 3 million deaths. During the study period, mortality rates decreased for men and women in all deciles, and reduction in absolute mortality rates were greater for males in the most deprived deciles and females in the least deprived deciles, whereas relative reduction was greater for males and females in the least deprived deciles. From the plot, you can also notice that in the last decade, the mortality rates in females are slightly higher across the most deprived deciles than for the males. So the proportion of mortality attributable to housing inequality varied by sex and time period. We observed an increase from 16 to 18% between the 1991 and 2000 and 2001 and 2010, so between these 2 decades, followed by a decrease of 12% in the following 9 years. In overall, the proportion of death attributable to inequality was higher for men, reaching about 26% between 2001 and 2010, and then for women, reaching between 12% between 2001 and 2010. And in both sexes, the PAH function peaked among the elderly, so among those age 65 plus. The years of life lost. So the life tables suggested that if everyone had mortality rates of the least deprived decile, premature mortality, that is the mortality prior age 75, would be reduced to a mean of 1.75 between the years 1991 and 2000, 1.37 between the years 2001 and 2010, and 0.44 for the last 9 years, so between 2011 and 2019. Years of life lost per person, I'm referring to. Which is about 24, 29, and 11% of years of life lost due to premature mortality that can be attributable to housing inequality. So I would like to summarize that we used data from the whole population of Belgium to provide a population level estimate of the housing inequality and give an insight into changing inequalities over 29 years. We found large differences in mortality that might be associated with socioeconomic inequality, here defined as housing inequality. And our study suggests that a large proportion of premature deaths could be avoided, as well as reduction in years of life lost could be achieved by eliminating housing inequalities. Therefore, ensuring good housing conditions seems a necessary step to reduce inequalities, and its improvements should be considered in new social policies. So that's all from me today. Thank you very much for your attention, and please do not hesitate to ask me a question or shoot me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. That was great.
I apologize for the cat meowing. I don't know how much you had to hear that.
No, I heard. I didn't hear anything, but I have the same problem. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it was.
It's dinner time. It's dinner
time.
time. Yeah, they're very hungry. I get it. So we have some questions from Ed. Do you have a question for Martina? Oh, no, he doesn't. He's changed his mind. I actually had a quick question. I have a couple. Well, I found the table that you showed around the years lives YLL table, the differences in social policy. I'm kind of curious, who owns the housing where the people are living? Do you see a difference between public housing and rental housing and ownership? Or did you look at that?
No, actually, so my main goal, I'm doing PhD, and my main goal is to create an index of multiple deprivation. So the index of multiple deprivation, it's has multiple domains, and one of the domains is housing. And this presentation is based on that domain. So it's always about deprivation. We don't look into, for instance, the proportion of individuals who live in a public or private housing. We just looked only on those who are renting the apartments, so partially. But in Belgium, the trend is more for renting. So it's not like, for instance, in the US, where many people are, or maybe the high proportion of people are the homeowners. But in Belgium, it's quite common to just rent an apartment. So now I've kind of maybe I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's around the housing conditions. Are they like government-owned housing, or is it regular rental housing? I think that was you answered my question already a bit, but
yeah. In terms of quality, it really differs, and I think that probably the own housing is has better quality than the publicly owned or rental housing, but it's not something that I would focus on.
Okay, great. Well done. I think we made up for the time as well. So that was very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fine, okay, so the last presentation for today is from Ed Keeley. Is that how I say your last name? Keeley or Kylie?
It's Kylie.
Kylie, okay. And he's from the University of Cambridge, and you're going to talk about knowledge production in local council commissioning, correct?
That's right. I'll just see if I can share slides. Is that showing?
Yes, it is. You're doing great. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. So hi everyone. The title of the presentation is Their Own Front Door: An Agnotology of Knowledge Production in Local Council Commissioning. This is going to be the third empirical chapter of my PhD thesis, which I'm in the process of writing at the moment. And it's in quite an early stage, so any feedback is really gratefully received. In terms of the structure of the presentation, I'm going to start with a very brief overview of my whole project, and then I'm going to move on to talk about how austerity was framed within the local authority where I was conducting my fieldwork. Broadly speaking, this was an optimistic framing of austerity. Austerity was seen to have positive effects on health service commissioning, which kind of stretched forward into the future. And then what I'm going to do in the third part is offer a bit of a case study of the production and circulation of knowledge in the council. And I'm going to argue that these created a blind spot around the harms associated with austerity. And this is what contributed to the production of this austerity optimism. So, to very briefly summarise the project as a whole, my PhD looks at the impact of austerity on mental health service provisions. I'm really taking the work of Hester Parr as the sort of jumping off point here. And what I'm trying to do is evaluate what she termed a set of inclusionary geographies around mental health. She was writing in the 1990s and the noughties. And I'm trying to look and kind of critically interrogate these inclusionary geographies in light of the UK austerity programme that was introduced after 2010. So in terms of the fieldwork I was conducting, that took place between June 2019 and then had to be stopped in March 2020 as a result of the pandemic. I was conducting participant observation in 2 mental health services in the south of England. These were across 2 demographically contrasting towns. And then this was complemented by fieldwork within the mental health commissioning team of the local authority, which was responsible for distributing funding and which funded in different ways both of these services. So I worked across the 2 services for about 5 months in total, and then I was in the council for another 2 months. And obviously today I'm speaking about my time in the council. I also conducted unstructured interviews lasting between about 1 and 3 hours. Unfortunately, again, due to COVID, I lost the period when I was meant to be conducting my interviews within the 2 mental health services. So there's a bit of a shortfall there. More interviews took place in the council. So to contextualize the research in the council, I'm kind of trying to address a couple of gaps in the geographical literature on everyday austerity. So this is kind of the ways in which austerity is felt and perceived in everyday life. Firstly, this literature tends to focus on the experiences of people who are kind of experiencing cuts, who are at the sharp end of cuts. And there's not been quite as much focus on people who are actually delivering the cuts, who are doing the cutting of budgets. Secondly, within this literature, austerity tends to get conceptualized as a kind of absent presence. It's noticeable at some points, it's less noticeable at others. And in general, what authors within this field have been interested in is explaining those moments when austerity manifests, when people start to feel that austerity has happened in some way, rather than the opposite, the moment when it kind of dissipates. I'm trying to look more at this idea of dissipation, because I think this is important if we're trying to understand what I'm calling the kind of camouflaging of austerity, and I've written about this elsewhere. So processes by which the effects of budget cuts kind of get concealed, basically, and help people not to notice the impacts of budget cuts. So that's the project as a whole. From the overview, I want to move into the specificity of the fieldwork in the local council. I spent most of my time there attending meetings between the different members of the mental health commissioning team, or with other commissioning teams, with other internal teams, with senior staff, with service providers. But there was hardly ever a kind of clear moment where it felt like a decision was being made. Everything felt very gradual, very conditional, very relational. I felt a bit like I was on the surface trying to, observe the movement of a tectonic plate deep underneath. But at the same time, there were all these major changes that were actually happening and that were forming the backdrop for this everyday experience. In the previous 9 years, the council had cut 44% from its annual budget, and there was another £100 million of cuts approximately that were going to be made over the next 2 financial years. And that was the kind of project that all the staff were working on at that point. So I think part of this camouflaging, this concealing of austerity, was that way in which these big shifts in terms of funding got kind of folded into the backdrop of the everyday. I was also interested, and the reason I started to really think about this idea of kind of camouflaging was because, as I said earlier, staff in the council tended to offer a really optimistic interpretation of austerity. So what they felt, broadly speaking, was that by cutting spending, they'd actually enhanced and would continue to enhance service provision within the local area. So I've got just a few quotes here from council staff. So this is what Lewis said: "I'm not a fan of austerity, but it has forced us to think more innovatively and more radically and in a more disciplined way. We have more interesting and more innovative and more effective models, and I think that's given us a really interesting way of commissioning things into the future." And then for Carl, "Whilst it's lovely to have big budgets, as I've always said when austerity hit, don't let a good crisis go to waste, because actually it gave us an opportunity to look at much more innovative and far more sustainable approaches." And for Sarah, "There's certain things that austerity has enabled us to look at more creatively and push people," I don't want to say push people through services, but enable them to work for their goals and aspirations rather than actually maintaining the status quo. Now, the reason I'm suggesting that there was a kind of camouflaging of the harms of austerity going on in these optimistic interpretations is partly because there's a lot of national level evidence to suggest that austerity has worsened mental health and worsened mental health provision. And this was supported by some interviews that I conducted with frontline staff, with service users, survivors, people who are in these services, and people who were having daily contact with the services were kind of unanimous that there hadn't really been any improvements that they'd kind of noticed. So I was interested to understand, how and why did the staff in the council come to offer these positive evaluations of austerity? And that's the overall question that I'm trying to address within the second and the third chapters of my thesis. So broadly speaking, in terms of today's paper, I'm kind of framing this as a piece of agnotology. So this is a phrase used by Tom Slater to refer to the production of ignorance, basically. Now, importantly, Slater's talking about this in terms of the willful production of ignorance within an institution. And this is kind of similar to the way in which Lindsay McGoey uses the term when she writes about strategic ignorance. So situations where organizations are kind of deliberately attempting to not know something. And there's examples here around sort of tobacco companies not being interested in evidence of harms caused by tobacco. There's also a kind of sizable body of literature around this idea of the production of ignorance, I think you could say, from within Black feminist epistemology, where ignorance is seen to be a kind of key technology of white supremacy. So the work of Christy Dotson, Patricia Hill Collins, but also within geography, Azizat Johnson, Patricia Daly have written about this. And from within this body of kind of Black feminist work, I'm drawing on Gloria Vecker's concept of the blind spot, which Vecker argues is central to the production of what she calls white innocence. So this is this idea that you kind of create institutional structures which are blind to the violence and the harm caused by racism and white supremacy, and then that allows white people within former colonial powers to deny that they're implicated in racism. Now, the reason I'm interested in this line of argument, and I think it's more relevant to the context that I'm writing about, in contrast to Slater and McGoey, is because this is not necessarily, according to Vecker, a kind of conscious process. She frames it more as involving a kind of displacement or a repression of a knowledge that's uncomfortable. You know, I proclaim myself innocent in order to assuage myself of guilt, but still on some level I know that I'm implicated in guilt as well. So that's why I'm kind of applying it here. I'm trying to be careful in how I do this. I'm not trying to suggest that austerity and white supremacy are similar processes, they have similar consequences. I'm just trying to suggest that I think in this context, there were similar institutional practices involved in the kinds of unseeing that were taking place in relation to austerity and in relation to the kind of institutional whiteness of the council. And I'm going to be writing about institutional whiteness and white supremacy in the final part of my thesis, which I'm not going to kind of go into here. So that's the kind of the way that I'm thinking about this kind of suppression of knowledge of these harms, basically a kind of looking the other way on an almost unconscious level. And I'm going to try and make this argument by presenting in the final part of this paper a case study of how knowledge was kind of produced and circulated within the council to demonstrate some of the ways in which I think these institutional blind spots emerged. So what I'm going to be talking about is the image of their own front door. And this was a phrase that came up really frequently in my time at the council. It came up in interviews, it was cited in documents, people referenced it in meetings. And what the people in the council were using their own front door to reference was a piece of research that had been done, which showed basically that what people with, you know, as they refer to them, sort of mental health service users, clients, want is to have their own front door. They want to have their own place to live. They want to have their own kind of responsibility for where they live. And I was interested in why it was this particular image, this insight into the kind of supposed lives of service users, why had this gained so much traction within the council? And I think that what this phrase and this particular piece of knowledge shows is a kind of, it shows us three factors, if you like, which determined when a piece of knowledge was going to circulate and when it was going to gain traction within this particular institutional context. And this all contributed to this production of this blind spot around harm. So firstly, knowledge needs to be mobile. An insight, a piece of knowledge within the council, it needs to be able to travel, which is why I was coming across this idea of their own front door in so many different places. But what this also means is that the knowledge is getting uprooted from its conditions of production. We don't know the social or the epistemological conditions in which the knowledge is being produced, so we can't critique it. It becomes a kind of axiom, it's sort of self-evident, and in order to travel in this way, it needs to be simple and easy to share. So what you're losing is a lot of the nuance and complexity, but also you're losing sight of the disagreements within that kind of community. So if you like, it's creating a homogenous community of service users who all want the same thing, when actually that in itself is a space of kind of contention and different intersections as well. Secondly, knowledge needs to be comprehensible. And this is where the demographics of the council become really important. The staff were overwhelmingly white and middle class. So the audience need to be that's the audience that needs to be like won over by each piece of knowledge and convinced. And if we look closely at the phrase, their own front door, there's some othering language there. You know, it's their own front door, it's they, them. But actually what the council staff tends to do is make this rhetorical move. And you can see it in this quote from Lewis, where they go from they, them to us. They want their own front door. You know, they, as Lewis says, they want to feel part of society. They want a job, all the usual things that we all kind of want, really. So there's a move of othering, and that's simultaneously folded into a move back to a kind of intimacy, proximity, and a kind of understanding. There's, if you like, a kind of disavowal of difference that's going on here. And this kind of comes back to some of what Becker argues about white innocence. There's a disavowal that goes on there. We're all the same. There's no such thing as racial difference. Why can't we all just get along? So I'd suggest that this contributes to this blind spot by kind of filtering out critique, obscuring social difference, obscuring some of the axes across which the harms of austerity tend to materialize. And it's kind of reproducing normativity, it's reproducing normative whiteness in this institutional context. And finally, knowledge needs to be actionable. A bureaucracy needs to take decisions, it needs a direction of travel. Bureaucracies, as Bauman argued, are really incapable of handling ambiguity. And actionable also means it needs to be measurable. You know, the council needs to know if what it's doing is having an effect. So what their own front door does is it gives the council staff a metric. Our services are working if fewer people are using them, if more people are in work, if more people are in their own homes. So again, this, you know, this kind of gets rid of some of that complexity and nuance, but I think it also creates a blind spot around harm by giving the council staff a moral alibi. We are doing our jobs well if certain numbers go up, so that people in, you know, certain services increase and certain numbers go down. If we get people into housing services from this service, we are doing our jobs well. We don't really need to consider any of the broader implications of cutting budgets. So kind of to conclude, this is why I'm sort of thinking about this as a blind spot. It's not a deliberate strategic ignorance. It's not a rising out of a sense of indifference. The staff in the council talked a lot about research. They really felt that what they were doing was very, very grounded in research, and it was grounded in a sense of moral responsibility. This is what they also communicated to me. But at the same time, it was like the techniques that they were using, the way that they were perceiving was incapable of perceiving some of what was communicated to me in the interviews that I did, which were around the harms of austerity. So a blind spot here kind of arises from practices which end up excluding countervailing or complex evidence. And this is because the nature of the council bureaucracy means that knowledge has to be mobile, comprehensible, and actionable. So that's what creates that blind spot, if you like. And what this means in this context is that the withdrawal of services, the cutting of budgets, can then be framed as a moral good, as a way of making life better for people who are using those services. Ultimately, the strategic goal of the council is determined by something that's non-negotiable and legally enforceable, which is cuts to the budget. The council legally has to deliver those. So what that means, if you're then faced with an ambiguous context, is certain kinds of knowledge are going to stick. And the kinds of knowledge that end up sticking in this context is knowledge which supports the non-negotiable goal of budget cuts. So yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it, and yeah, open to hear any questions.
Well, thank you, Ed. I think that can make some people pretty upset or angry at the end of the day. I had no insight into this topic at all. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Now I know the difference with the applauding sign. Thank you, Ed, for saying it wasn't a hand up. I'm kind of curious, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with knowledge translation tools or frameworks that are often used in public health, but I think something similar to some of those frameworks may be of interest in ways of delivering the knowledge in a way that's understandable or valuable to all the stakeholders. It's going to be a bit of an impossible task, but I think even taking that approach would be valuable. My other question, my question had to be, has to relate to COVID, and I really didn't want to bring it up, but do you feel that after this pandemic, we all know that people's mental health probably hasn't been very well, it's underreported. In the next couple of years, do you think these austerity measures will shift once again, noticing the demand for services that people experience? Yeah.
So I think there's kind of two parts to that. There's kind of two parts to that question. I think there's firstly a question around the framing of the impact of COVID in terms of mental health, which I think is important, and that can be a way of kind of like mobilizing resources that need to be mobilized. But I think the flip side of it as well is it feeds into some of that stuff that I was referencing there around we are all alike and we are all the same. You know, it can have a flattening effect, and what that obscures is the very, very differential impacts that COVID has had on very different people due to in particular intersections of kind of class and race. So I think that I was slightly concerned. I did kind of keep speaking to people in the council throughout COVID, and I was slightly concerned in the way that mental health continued to be framed as sort of something that we have all got without really attending to some of those nuances of differential impact. I think in terms of the funding outlook, mixed messages in terms of the UK picture. So councils have tended to have to spend upfront very, very highly to respond to the pandemic, and the government has generally been quite lax at announcing additional funding to compensate for those shortfalls. So there's been a bit of a lag effect there, which I think then incentivizes further service cuts. Because the council are thinking on a year-on-year basis, they don't know if that money is going to be coming back from the government. So it seems likely that it's not really referred to as austerity anymore. Austerity is supposed to be over, but in practice, I think councils are going to be living with further de facto austerity. And again, even though the government have been really, really willing to spend in order to support the response to COVID, there have been a few comments, particularly from the Chancellor, Sunak, that suggest that there is going to be there's going to be some sort of backlash, and there's going to end up probably being kind of continued cuts further down the line. There's still been rhetorics of, you know, this debt has to be paid for. And of course, the national debt at the moment is pushing to historically high levels as well, which was the same context which was used to introduce austerity in 2010. So I'm not optimistic, basically.
Well, thank you so much and if you have any questions for Ed, please send him an email. But I want to thank all of you for your presentation this afternoon. And if we are able to plan cities or places for the future based on this type of research, I think the future is bright. So I hope that happens. You'll see in the chat, Tom has placed a link for a voting session for this session. So if you want to skip over there, and I believe someone, maybe Tom, is going to take over now.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. That was thank you for chairing, and thanks to all the presenters in this session. So yeah, we've come to the end of our second day at Energy. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to all the presenters, the keynote, Gabby and Andy in the workshop on mental health well-being. And yeah, so tomorrow we'll be starting at 9 o'clock in the UK time. We've got another good day of presentations and keynotes, and it's also the final day of the Energy Conference. If you are interested, there is a session or like a workshop tonight from Salford University, which I believe Louise will put a link in just to remind you. But obviously you can also look it up online perhaps. So then that leaves me with saying have a nice evening, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow for the final day of Energy. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.